This episode originally aired on June 27th, 2018.
Welcome to Business Infrastructure, the podcast about curing back office blues of fast-growing businesses. If you're a business owner or operator looking for practical tips and solutions to scaling your business in a sustainable manner, you're in the right place. Now here's your hostess, Alicia Butler Pierre.
Albert Einstein defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, today I'm going to get a little controversial in this episode and ask that when it comes to providing your product or service, that you become, frankly, insane. Because here's the thing. If you got a good thing going, you want to be able to replicate or clone your business to get the same results every single time. But in order to get those same results over and over, you need business infrastructure. Hello and welcome back to the Business Infrastructure Curing Back Office Blues show. I'm your hostess, Alicia Butler Pierre, and last week I had a chance to formally introduce myself to you, tell you a little bit about my career as a former process engineer and now as a full-blown entrepreneur, and how I came to actually start preaching and spreading the gospel of business infrastructure. So if you missed that, be sure to go back and check out that first episode. The other thing that I covered in the first episode is explaining exactly what business infrastructure actually is. So as a recap, business infrastructure, get yourselves ready for this, is a system that links a company's organizational goals with the people, processes, and tools necessary to support those goals in a profitable, scalable, and sustainable manner. Yes, that was a mouthful. But again, it's just a fancy way of saying that business infrastructure is nothing more than a way to define what needs to be done, who should do it, and how to do it, and linking all of that together so that it supports your business's goals. Now, today's focus on this episode is on why business infrastructure is needed for your small business. So let's first start off by defining exactly what I mean when I say small business, because I don't necessarily mean the definition that you may see presented by the SBA, where they define it based on a number of different factors and criteria depending on the type of industry that your business may operate in. For purposes of this show and our conversations around business infrastructure, I'm defining a small business as one that is privately owned, has less than about 150 employees combined, and I don't define small business based on income. I can think of a company right now off the top of my head that has less than 10 employees and nets $10 million in revenue. So when people hear small, a lot of times they think small money. And $10 million, it's actually $30 million. I apologize. It's a company that has, I think, between 9 and 10 employees, and they net about $30 million in revenue. So that's nothing to sneeze at. So I don't define small by income or revenue, but definitely by the size in terms of your number of employees. Now, many of you probably realize or know this, that small businesses are the backbone of most economies in the world. So in other words, small business is serious business. And this makes the case for why business infrastructure is needed. One, it's needed for standardization. Two, business infrastructure is needed to demonstrate your ability to scale your business. Three, it's needed for sustainable operations. When you build this business, build it to last. Don't build a house of cards, build a pyramid, something that will outlast you. And lastly, business infrastructure is needed to create a consistent experience for your customers as well as your staff. Remember when I said earlier about you need to be insane? This is a time when you want to be insane. If your customers and your staff are all singing your praises, they're having a great experience with you, they love whatever product or service you may provide them, keep doing that. And if you change it for the better. Make the experience even better. But make sure that it's consistently delivered. Now, if you are really serious about scale, then business infrastructure is an absolute must. Now, something else that I covered in the first episode was explaining what I mean by scale, because so many times when we hear people or consultants out there talk to us about scaling our businesses, they're really talking about it from a marketing perspective. In other words, they are teaching you strategies and tactics to actually help bring in more business. But what I'm talking about is scaling your business from an operational perspective. So as you grow, you're going to need more people, processes, tools. In other words, the business infrastructure. And the key is to replicate what you do best. Consistency is vital to your ongoing success, however you define success for you and your small business. But here's what I know for sure, that you have to think long-term and not short-term. Have you ever read a book called The E-Myth by 𝗍𝗂𝗋𝗋? If you haven't, I suggest that you order that book ASAP. And here's why. He makes an excellent case for what he defines as systematizing your business so that it can be franchised. Now, he makes the argument that even though you may not want to franchise your business, you want to be able to have your business documented and structured in such a way that as you continue expanding, it's almost like you've created a franchise model for your business. That regardless of who performs the work, the experience that your customer has will always be consistent. Now, many people think that it just isn't possible. I'll never forget, about 8 or 9 years ago, I was doing some work for a client who owned a nonprofit organization, and I had a very interesting conversation with one of his employees one day. And we were talking about business and the things that I like to talk about as it relates to business, which is about scaling, business infrastructure, operational excellence, those kinds of things. And his employee said to me, you know, that all sounds really good, but it's virtually impossible for a small business to become a large publicly traded enterprise in one person's lifetime. And I looked at him, and I just had to call BS on it. I just had to. And I gave him, off the top of my head, right there in front of him, the names of at least 10 well-known companies where they had actually accomplished, the original founders and entrepreneurs of those companies had actually achieved that. I want to share with you in this episode at least 2 examples of well-known products in the business world that may never have come to be were it not for business infrastructure. Here's the first example. Back in the early 80s, a man by the name of Rob Campbell made a keen observation. He was on a flight from Boston to California, and he noticed that half of the people sitting in coach, which I thought was really funny as I listened to different interviews of him telling this story. He said that's where the place where most entrepreneurs should be sitting is in Coach. But he noticed that half of the people sitting in Coach were all wearing business suits, fumbling through their briefcases, tinkering with these transparency slides for their presentations. Now, some of you may not be old enough to remember the days of having to give presentations using transparency slides, but believe me, it could become very cumbersome. Now, out of Rob Campbell's own frustration and seeing a need for people to be more efficient in producing graphical presentations, the idea for PowerPoint was born. Eventually, he linked up with a venture capitalist, a man by the name of 𝗳𝗃𝗃𝗃, who believed in the viability of PowerPoint so much that he actually used his own money, going against his venture capital firm because they didn't want to fund PowerPoint. The 𝗳𝗃𝗃𝗃 actually went against the grain, went against the company that he worked for, that VC firm, used his own money to pour into this fledgling company. And after a series of hardships, once PowerPoint actually went to market, it was a raving success. And they literally generated double the amount of revenue that they forecasted. They thought it would bring in about $1 million right off the bat. It ended up being somewhere between $2.5 to $3 million. Now, they were really excited about this, obviously, because they had proof of concept. There was definitely a market. So 𝗳𝗃𝗃𝗃, the VC, thought that they had enough at this point to validate or justify taking the company public. But Rob Campbell, the man who conceived the idea for PowerPoint, was a little hesitant. He said, well, you know, Dick, I don't know. He said, and I quote, "We don't have the structure. We don't have the structure." Eventually, Microsoft acquired PowerPoint in an all-cash transaction for $14 million. But check this out. They actually offered Rob Campbell and 𝗳𝗃𝗃𝗃 and all the other people who were behind PowerPoint at that point in time, they actually offered them stock options. So needless to say, they all regret that decision today. Now that's one example. And that example comes from a documentary called Something Ventured. And that documentary, if you're interested in going to check it out, I've watched it on Netflix several times. I think you can also catch it on YouTube. But it's about the first venture capitalists who, along with the entrepreneurs that they funded, put everything on the line to create the computer hardware and software that we enjoy today.
I know. It was just starting to get good, right? Well, there's more where that came from. To listen to the full interview, be sure to click the link in the description box below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell so that you'll know when our next episode drops. Until then, keep operating smoothly.
Join us next week for another episode of Business Infrastructure with Alicia Butler Pierre.